Hey there, tonight we ease into the quiet corridors of a very different kind of medieval world. Not the one of gallant knights riding into tournaments or noble ladies weaving tapestries by candlelight, but the shadowy places between those stories. The alleys, the staircases at the back of castles, the corners of taverns where no one wanted to sit too close. Tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous life of the assassin. It is tempting, of course, to picture them as stories do, to imagine someone in a dark cloak face hidden by a hood leaping gracefully across rooftops with the elegance of a cat. Hollywood has given us a certain picture, one that is clean, precise, and strangely admirable. But the truth was far less shining. In fact, being a medieval assassin was more miserable than anything else, the kind of life one slid into when all other doors had closed. Before we walk further, let's make ourselves comfortable. Perhaps dim the lights in your room or switch on a small fan to provide a steady hum in the background. Let that sound be like the murmur of distant voices in a medieval tavern, steady and unthreatening. As always, if you're enjoying these gentle journeys into history, I'd be grateful for a simple like or even a subscribe if you truly enjoy what we do here. It helps more than you might imagine. And I always love seeing the comments, where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It is strangely soothing to think of this community scattered across continents and time zones, all meeting here in the quiet. Now let us slip slowly into the past. Imagine a medieval town at night. The cobblestones are uneven, underfoot still damp from an afternoon rain. The market square, so lively during the day, lies silent with only scraps of straw and the odd wandering dog. The great castle on the hill looms dark and heavy, its walls holding secrets behind layers of stone. Somewhere, perhaps in the shadow of a stable wall, a man waits. He does not think of himself as an assassin, not in any noble dramatic sense. He is simply someone who has been paid or promised to carry out a grim task. A task that no one with comfort or fortune would ever accept, because that is the first truth we must understand. No one in medieval times set out in life hoping to become an assassin. It was not a calling, and it was not a profession passed down through families. There were no fathers proudly showing sons how to sharpen daggers for their future careers, no guild halls filled with banners and training exercises. To arrive at this point in life meant that something had gone terribly wrong. The men, and very occasionally women who ended up in this shadow trade, were almost always those with nothing left to lose. Peasants who had slipped through the cracks of their villages, their fields gone, their families lost to famine or plague. Soldiers discharged from service who could fight but no longer had a lord to pay them. Thieves who had been caught one too many times and who carried scars from rope burns on their wrists. They were the cast-offs, the forgotten, the ones whose names were missing from the census rolls. If you had any land, a steady trade, or even a few goats and a family to keep you warm, you would never risk it by slipping into the world of hired blades. For those who did, the work was not a path chosen, but a last stop on the train of desperation. Imagine the feeling of being asked to take on a job like this. A small purse of coins slid across a table in a tavern. A whispered name. It was never John, the quiet turnip farmer. No one paid for that. It was always someone powerful, a corrupt baron who had taxed his people into misery, a bishop whose wealth was too tempting, or a captain of soldiers who stood in someone else's way. Targets were often men who travelled with guards, who lived in stone fortresses, who locked their doors with 3 heavy bolts. To even consider such a job meant you were standing at the far edge of society where the next step forward was oblivion. And yet here you were, hungry, desperate, with perhaps just enough skill to pass unnoticed through a crowded street, or just enough nerve to climb quietly into a window. In the candlelit hush of the tavern, you might murmur your agreement. Perhaps you would even dare to ask for half the money up front, though you knew well that it was a request as dangerous as the job itself. Then, with the faint clink of coins in a pouch, you were marked. There were no benefits to this work. No pension, no security, not even the grim honor that soldiers sometimes clung to when they died in battle. You could never admit what you did aloud. If anyone asked your trade, you lied. A carpet seller, perhaps. A wandering monk. A labourer passing through on his way to some other town. And if anyone pushed too hard, you gave them a crooked smile and left before they could think twice. The irony, of course, was that you were not the hero of your own story. You were not even the villain. You were a footnote, a shadow that brushed against the lives of more important people and left nothing but unease behind. And in the end, you likely would not even live long enough to spend whatever money you were promised. But in that moment, sitting in the smoky warmth of the tavern or crouched in the stillness of a courtyard at night, you told yourself there was no other choice. And perhaps in a way there wasn't, because by the time someone considered this life, they had already lost nearly everything. So tonight, as we begin this long walk together through history, let us set aside the sleek romantic picture painted by stories. Let us imagine instead the worn boots, the cold hunger and the nervous hands of those who took on such tasks. They were not legends, they were not myths, they were ordinary people pressed by extraordinary desperation into an existence lived in whispers and shadows. This is where our journey begins, at the edges of medieval life, where desperation and danger blended into silence. When we think of assassins today, it is easy to imagine them as born killers, people groomed for violence, trained since youth and bound to a hidden order. But the reality of medieval Europe was far more mundane and far more tragic. No one began life with the thought, "I shall one day creep through the night and stab a noble in his bed." Instead, those who took up such work were almost always the discarded and the desperate. Picture a medieval village. Most of its people were tied to the land. They were farmers tending barley, wheat or rye. They kept goats, pigs, or perhaps just a scrawny cow tethered to a patch of grass. They paid taxes to their lord, sometimes in coin, but often in grain or labour. Life was not easy, but it was steady in its rhythm, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, prayers and festivals binding the months together. If you had that life, you would not risk it by turning to assassination. It may have been hard, but it was a kind of security. So who ended up drifting away from this world of fields and families? Often they were men who had lost everything. A harvest might fail, leaving a household ruined. A plague might sweep through, taking parents, children or siblings. In the wake of such tragedies, some simply moved on, wandering into towns where no one knew their names. A man without land or kin was a man without protection, and that left him vulnerable to the darker trades. Others came from war. Medieval Europe was never entirely at peace. Lords fought over borders, barons rebelled against kings and kingdoms, waged endless campaigns abroad. Soldiers were always needed, but once a war ended, or once a lord had no more coin to pay his men, those same soldiers were cast adrift. They had training, yes, but only of the blunt kind: how to march, how to hold a spear, how to follow orders. Some joined bands of mercenaries hired by whoever could afford them. Others slipped into banditry, robbing travellers on lonely roads. And a few were whispered about men who sold their skills for something more precise, the quiet removal of a rival. Ex-thieves also made their way into this world. A thief who had learned to move silently, to climb into windows, or to slip unnoticed through a marketplace, already had the raw skills. If such a person was caught scarred by prison and found no honest way back into society, he might be approached for a job of a darker sort. "You climb well," someone might remark in a tavern. "Would you climb one more wall for a price?" There were also those who were simply invisible in their own time. People who had slipped so far beyond the edges of society that no one would miss them. A beggar with no family, a wanderer with no trade, a woman who had fled from her household and lived in disguise as a man. They were the kinds of figures who could move unnoticed because no one cared enough to notice them at all. It was not glory that drove them, it was hunger. Hunger in the most literal sense, the ache of an empty stomach, the weight of winter when firewood was scarce. And hunger of another kind too, for survival, for a place in a world that had rejected them. The promise of coin heavy and real in a small leather pouch was enough to make them consider it. But it is important to remember the clients were not the poor. If you had enough wealth to hire someone to do your killing for you, you belonged to the ranks of the powerful. Nobles hired assassins to rid themselves of rivals. Bishops with ambitions for higher office might have considered it. Merchants with fortunes to protect sometimes whispered names to men with quick hands. In the hierarchy of medieval life, assassination was a service the rich paid for and the desperate performed. And so a kind of silent understanding grew. If you were too visible, too tied to land or family, you were safe from such a life. You might fear assassins, but you would not become one. If you were too poor, too far forgotten, you might one day be approached in the dark. And if you said yes, you stepped onto a path that rarely let anyone return. Imagine one such man. He might once have been a soldier in a lord's retinue marching under banners stitched with lions or crosses. He fought at a skirmish near the border where arrows fell and men shouted, and he survived. But when the war ended, his lord paid him nothing more than a pat on the shoulder and sent him away. With no land to farm, no coin in his purse, and no welcome in the villages he passed through, he drifted. Now, months later, he sits in the corner of a tavern. His hands are calloused, his clothes patched. He has not eaten in a day. Someone slides onto the bench beside him. A pouch of coins appears on the table. A whisper follows. Or perhaps it is a woman rare but not impossible. Perhaps her family was ruined by debt and she fled into the forest rather than be married off against her will. Perhaps she disguised herself as a man living rough among thieves. She too might one day find herself carrying a blade, not for self-defense but for a name spoken in secret, who became an assassin. Not heroes, not the glamorous figures of legend, but the ones who had fallen through the cracks of their own world. The ones who had no protection, no prospects, and no place to go. They were survivors in the most desperate sense. And that is perhaps the saddest truth of all, because to be such a person was to already be invisible, already erased from the stories told at hearth fires and in churches. The assassin's life was not chosen. It was stumbled into a consequence of being forgotten by the world. So as we sit here tonight with the comfort of light and warmth around us, let us imagine that shadowed figure at the edge of the medieval square. He is not a legend, not a master, not even a villain. He is simply someone who lost his way in life, and who now waits coin in hand for a chance to eat again tomorrow. It is tempting to believe that those who carried out quiet killings in the medieval world were trained, prepared, and disciplined much like the knights of the age. Knights, after all, were raised from childhood to handle weapons. Boys of noble families began their training at 7 or 8 years old, first as pages, then as squires, before finally being dubbed knights. Their lives were shaped by structure, by ritual, by endless practice with sword and lance. Guild members too, blacksmiths, masons, weavers, all passed through apprenticeships, learning slowly from masters, absorbing the knowledge of generations. But assassins had no such schooling. There were no masters waiting to instruct them, no manuals written on how to slip into a noble's chamber, no official guild hall where one might learn the arts of poison or stealth. The assassin's training, if we can call it that, came from necessity. It was the training of survival. Imagine someone who had never before attempted such a task. The first job might have been clumsy, even foolish. Perhaps he tried to use a dagger that was too dull. Perhaps he made too much noise stepping on a loose stone that clattered in the dark. Perhaps he found himself in the wrong chamber altogether, facing a servant instead of the intended target. Each mistake was dangerous. Many died before they ever completed a single task. Those who lived long enough to learn those were the ones we hear whispers of in the shadows of history. There were no practice yards, no staged rehearsals. Instead, every attempt was a gamble. To creep across a wooden floor taught you to place your feet carefully, avoiding the boards that groaned. To scale a castle wall taught you to test each stone with your fingers, to feel for the ones that might shift loose and betray you. To mix a powder of herbs in hopes of creating a poison taught you that too much or too little was as deadly to yourself as it was to your victim. The closest thing to mentorship came from occasional encounters with thieves, mercenaries, or other desperate souls. A thief might teach you to move silently, to walk with your weight in your toes rather than your heels. A soldier might show you how to hold a blade in a grip firm enough to pierce but light enough to move quickly. But such lessons were rare, fleeting, and usually unspoken. One did not announce oneself as an assassin. One did not advertise such a trade. The fewer people who knew what you did, the longer you lived. And so most of what was learned alone. There is something quietly tragic in that. Knights had ceremonies, squires had feasts, guild apprentices had festivals when they were welcomed into their craft. Assassins had none of this. Their graduation, if we might use the word, was survival itself. Every scar on the hand, every bruise from a climb gone wrong, every narrow escape from a guard's glance, these were the lessons, these were the marks of progress. Consider poison, often thought of as the assassin's subtle art. In truth, medieval poisons were unreliable at best. They were made from plants gathered in forests and fields, plants that might look nearly identical yet have very different effects. Hemlock, nightshade, monkshood, they could all be deadly, but they could also simply make someone ill or even leave them alive and suspicious. An assassin mixing such herbs had no science to guide him. He had only word of mouth, fragments of folk knowledge, and the terrible willingness to test his mixture. Sometimes that test came upon his target, sometimes tragically upon himself. Weapons were equally humble. There was no secret cache of specially forged blades. Most assassins carried what they could find, or steal: a dagger taken from a careless guard, a kitchen knife sharpened on stone, a length of rope knotted into a garrote. If you had military experience, you might carry a short sword, though even that risked drawing suspicion. And unlike soldiers who could polish their armor or boast of their swords, assassins hid their tools. Wrapped in cloth, tucked into boots, concealed beneath ragged cloaks, their weapons were as secretive as their trade. And the greatest skill of all was not the strike itself, but what followed. Anyone can thrust a knife if desperate enough. What separated survival from disaster was the escape, learning where the doors led, which alleyways curved back into the market, which roofs connected across the narrow streets. This was the true training. The art was not in the kill, but in vanishing before the shouts could rise. There was a mental training too, though it came at a cost. To steady trembling hands, to swallow the fear that rose when footsteps echoed behind you, to silence your breath when hiding in the dark. These were lessons learned not in practice, but in the moments between life and death. And each success carried not triumph, but the burden of knowing you would soon be asked to do it again. In this way, the assassin's training was unlike any other in the medieval world. It was solitary, it was dangerous, it was endless. There was no final ceremony, no point at which one could say, "I am complete." There was only the next task and the hope that the lessons of yesterday would be enough to carry you through tomorrow. If we pause and imagine it, there is something deeply lonely in this picture. A boy might train for years to be a blacksmith, guided by his master, his progress marked by the shaping of iron into plowshares or horseshoes. His family might one day gather to see his first work sold at market. A girl might apprentice as a weaver, her skill growing, as she learned to spin and dye, her craft celebrated in the colourful cloth she produced. But the assassin's work could never be displayed. No family cheered, no master praised. His only measure of skill was that he remained alive, unseen, unnamed. And so when we ask how were assassins trained, the answer is both simple and chilling. They were not trained, they learned by doing, they learned by surviving. And those who did not, their names, their faces, their very existence vanished into the silence of the medieval night. If there was one thing that drew men and women into the shadows, it was coin, cold, heavy, and real. The clink of silver against silver, the soft weight of a purse in the palm, these were powerful promises in a world where most people measured wealth in sacks of grain or a goat tethered to a post. To someone hungry, to someone who had nothing left, even the glimpse of a few coins could be intoxicating. And so most assassins agreed to their work, not out of loyalty or ideology, but out of desperation for that promise. But here is the cruel truth. More often than not, the promise was a lie. The arrangement was simple in theory. A client, perhaps a lord, hoping to rid himself of a rival, or a bishop seeking to silence opposition, would approach quietly, often through an intermediary. A name would be whispered, a task described, and then a pouch of coins would appear. The assassin was usually given half the payment in advance with the rest promised upon completion. It sounded reasonable, even fair. But in reality it was nothing of the sort, because when the deed was done the client had no reason to honor the agreement. Indeed, they had every reason not to. Why pay someone who might one day use that money to betray you? Why leave alive the one person who knew you had arranged a killing? From the moment the blade fell, the assassin's usefulness was over. What remained was only risk. And in a world ruled by fear, risk was dealt with quickly. There are whispers in chronicles and letters, fragments of gossip preserved in monasteries of assassins who returned from a job only to find the promised client vanished. The tavern where they were meant to meet was closed. The messenger who had delivered the offer was nowhere to be found. And sometimes the assassin did not even have the chance to discover betrayal slowly. Sometimes a knife appeared in his back the moment he returned. Payment in coin replaced with payment in silence, and there was no court of appeal. Imagine an assassin walking into the great hall of a medieval court, standing before a judge and declaring, "My lord, I wish to sue the Duke for failing to pay me for a murder." It was impossible. The very nature of the work meant it was unspoken, unrecorded, beyond the reach of law. A blacksmith might complain if a lord failed to pay for horseshoes. A miller might bring a grievance if his flour was stolen. But an assassin had no such recourse. His work was done in the cracks of society, and in those cracks there was no justice, only risk. Sometimes betrayal came in another form. There were contracts that were never real to begin with. A lord might spread word that he wanted a rival dead, knowing that word would reach the ears of someone desperate. The assassin would take the bait attempt, the job, and find himself caught in a trap. Guards waiting gallows already prepared. In such cases, the assassin was not just unpaid, he was executed his death, a warning to others. Even when the coin was delivered, it was rarely enough. A handful of silver might seem generous to a starving man. But was it worth the weeks of planning, the risk of discovery, the certainty of being hunted afterward? When weighed against the danger, the coins always seemed too few. They bought food, yes. They bought a night's rest in an inn or a new cloak to replace the old one. But they could not buy peace. They could not buy safety. And sooner or later they were spent, leaving the assassin right where he began, only more desperate than before. It is easy from our modern vantage to imagine payment as simple silver past service rendered a grim but clean exchange. But medieval Europe did not work that way. Money itself was uncertain. A coin might be clipped, its silver shaved at the edges. A coin might be debased, mixed with copper, worth far less than it appeared. Trust was scarce, and in the shadow world of assassination it was non-existent. Every pouch of silver was both a temptation and a trap. We should pause here and think about what that meant for the assassin's mind. To live in a world where every client might betray you, where every contract might be false, where every promise of coin might instead be a path to a dungeon or a scaffold, it meant that trust, the most basic bond between human beings, was stripped away. And without trust, life became a long, lonely act of calculation. Do I take this job? Do I risk this meeting? Do I dare to believe this man's word? Most assassins learned quickly not to. They took what they could in advance. They demanded coin up front, even if it meant accepting less overall. They vanished after the job was done, disappearing into forests or across rivers, rather than returning to collect. They learned to live with suspicion because suspicion was safer than faith, and yet the hunger always returned. The pouch grew lighter, the cloak wore thin, the stomach growled again, and so the cycle repeated: betrayal, suspicion, desperation, coin. A wheel that turned endlessly until it threw the rider off. Perhaps the most bitter of all was this: even in success, the assassin remained nameless. If you built a church, your name might be remembered in stone. If you fought bravely in battle, your lord might reward you with land. But if you killed in silence, you were not meant to be remembered. You were paid to vanish, and vanishing was what you did. So when we imagine the assassin slipping into a courtyard at night or waiting in the corner of a tavern for a client's messenger, let us also imagine the quiet dread beneath it. Not only the fear of guards, but the fear of betrayal. Not only the danger of the task, but the uncertainty of whether the promised payment was real. A man who agreed to such work was not only risking his life in the act itself, he was risking it twice, once in the kill and again in the promise afterward. Coin was the lure, yes, but betrayal was the price, and it was a price paid again and again until nothing remained but shadows. When we imagine the assassin, we often imagine the weapon first. A curved dagger gleaming in the moonlight, or some ingenious device hidden beneath a sleeve. Perhaps even the smoke bombs and retractable blades so familiar from stories and games. But the real medieval assassin carried nothing so romantic, nothing so advanced. His tools were plain ordinary and often improvised. The dagger was the most common and perhaps the most reliable. It was not ornate, not beautifully balanced like the swords of knights, nor gilded with decoration like the blades carried by nobles. It was often stolen or bought second-hand or taken from the corpse of a careless guard. A simple iron blade, sometimes rust-spotted, sometimes dull, sharpened on rough stone until it was just sharp enough. This dagger was tucked away under a cloak, bound against the thigh or hidden in the folds of a boot. It was not meant to be admired, it was meant to be forgotten until the single moment it was needed. Other weapons were used as necessity demanded. A length of rope knotted into a garrote. It looked like nothing at all, just a cord that might bind a sack of grain or tie up a bundle of firewood. But in the assassin's hands it became a silent tool, terrible in its simplicity. A rope had the advantage of being unremarkable. No guard would question a man carrying a coil of cord through the marketplace. But when used in the shadows, it became something else entirely. Then there was poison. To our modern imagination, poison seems the height of subtlety, a drop in a goblet, a powder stirred into stew. The truth was far less elegant. Medieval poisons were unpredictable, made from plants and minerals whose potency varied from season to season, from leaf to leaf. Nightshade berries, hemlock, root-powdered arsenic scraped from minerals, all were used with uncertain effect. Some killed quickly, some killed slowly. Some simply made the victim ill, perhaps suspicious, perhaps enraged. There were no precise measures, no clear instructions. It was all guesswork and often dangerous for the one preparing it. An assassin who worked with poison risked not only his victim's life but his own. There were bows too, though rarely. To carry a bow marked you as a soldier or a hunter, and to smuggle one into a castle or a noble's hall was nearly impossible. Still, when distance was needed, the bow could serve. A single arrow loosed from the dark of a forest path, a shot taken from a rooftop at dawn, but such moments were rare. Most killings were done up close, personal and quick, and when nothing else was at hand, improvisation filled the gaps. A sharpened nail, a shard of broken tile, even the buckle from a shoe if it could be driven with force. Desperation does not wait for elegance. What mattered was not the weapon itself, but the speed and silence with which it was used. It is worth pausing here to consider the difference between these tools and those of other medieval trades. A blacksmith took pride in his hammer, polishing it, balancing its weight. A mason treasured his chisel, caring for it, keeping it sharp for years of service. A knight had his sword named and revered a companion through battle. But the assassin's tools were hidden unremarked and never praised. They were companions of silence. No one admired them. No one asked about them. In a way, the assassin's tools reflected the assassin himself, plain forgotten, used for a single purpose, then set aside. And yet there was a kind of intimacy to them. A dagger tucked against the skin, a cord wrapped carefully coiled and uncoiled in secret. These objects became extensions of the assassin's own body, not through pride but through necessity. In the end, the weapon was not what killed. It was the hand, the will, the desperation behind it. The tool was merely the bridge. Carrying these tools was itself a danger. To be caught with a dagger in the wrong place could mean the gallows. To be discovered with strange herbs could invite whispers of witchcraft. So concealment was as important as use. Daggers hidden in hems, cords disguised as belts, powders stored in pouches of dried herbs meant for cooking. An assassin had to be as much a smuggler as a killer, moving his tools unseen through the spaces where eyes were always watching. And unlike the weapons of knights or guards, there was no upgrading, no careful maintenance, no tinkering with improvements. There were no workshops to repair them, no smiths willing to ask questions. If a blade bent, it might be discarded. If a cord frayed, another was cut from whatever was at hand. Tools were temporary, fragile, expendable. They mirrored the life of their wielder, short, uncertain, always on the verge of being lost. There is a quiet sadness in this too. To imagine a man carrying the same simple dagger for years hidden, always never shown, never admired, never even acknowledged aloud. His only companion, his only guarantee, his only fragile hope of survival. And yet even that blade could betray him, breaking at the wrong moment, slipping in his hand, or falling with a clatter that brought guards running. So, when we imagine the assassin's toolkit, let us not think of shining steel and clever contraptions. Let us think instead of the plainest objects: a dagger roughened by time, a rope coiled like any farmer's rope, a pouch of herbs that might heal or might kill. These were the assassin's companions, ordinary things turned toward extraordinary purposes. And in the end, it was never the weapon that mattered most. It was the silence of footsteps, the silence of a strike, the silence afterward. The tools were only instruments. The true craft of the assassin lay in vanishing, in erasing himself as completely as the weapon he carried. The men and women who found themselves drifting into the shadows of assassination were not sent after easy prey. No one paid coin for the life of a turnip farmer or a potter's apprentice. If such a person fell, it was called misfortune, not intrigue. Assassins were employed for the most dangerous tasks of all the removal of men who mattered. These were barons who ruled wide stretches of land, bishops whose voices carried weight in Rome, captains of armies who held the loyalty of hardened men, and sometimes even kings themselves. They were the kind of figures who never walked alone, whose lives were woven into the fabric of politics and power. To reach such a man was not a simple matter of finding him in a darkened alley. It was a long and harrowing process, one that demanded more patience than skill. Imagine a castle, the heart of noble life in medieval Europe. Its walls rise high, thick with stone, the surface rough with the labor of masons who laid them generation by generation. At the base, a moat glimmers darkly. It may hold only water stagnant and cold, or it may be filled with sharpened stakes, or even creatures kept there for deterrent. Stories speak of eels or dogs released into the depths. Even if the moat was quiet, it still meant one thing: an obstacle between you and the gate. And the gate itself was not welcoming. A wooden portcullis, studded with iron, raised only for those whose names were known and trusted. Murder holes were cut into the ceilings of the entrance so that boiling oil or sand or even heavy stones could be poured down on attackers. Arrow slits lined the walls, narrow vertical cuts from which guards could release shafts without exposing themselves. An assassin approaching such a place did not merely see a fortress. He saw a death trap designed to notice every movement, every shadow, every mistake. Beyond the outer walls there were patrols, guards who knew the rhythm of their rounds, who counted the steps between towers, who shared wine in quiet corners but still kept one eye open. To slip past them required observation. Days, sometimes weeks, spent hiding in hedges or behind barns, watching as they moved, memorizing the timing of lanterns swinging through the dark. And even if the guards were careless, gossip itself could be just as dangerous. Servants, cooks, stable boys, they all knew who belonged and who did not. A face glimpsed once could become a story whispered twice and then carried straight to the captain of the watch. If you somehow made it into the household itself, you faced a new kind of wall, not of stone but of suspicion. Great men were paranoid, and rightly so. Nobles had rivals in their own families, brothers and cousins who might hire blades to remove them. They had rivals in neighboring lands, merchants and priests who longed to take their power. They knew that anyone could be an enemy. and so they surrounded themselves with testers, tasters, and layers of defense. Meals were tasted before they touched the table. Bedrooms had more than one exit, sometimes even hidden doors known only to the Lord and his closest servants. Locks were set not only on doors but on chests, closets, and chambers within chambers. Even the sleeping arrangements were uncertain. Some nobles rotated their chambers from night to night, resting in one room today, another tomorrow. It was a game of musical chairs played with shadows and fear. For an assassin it meant uncertainty. Even if you climbed the wall, crossed the moat, avoided the guards, and crept past the servants, you might still find yourself staring at an empty bed. And if the target was attending a feast, you might think the moment would be easier. Wine flowing, food, heavy guards distracted by the celebration. But a feast was no gift to the assassin. A feast meant a hall full of people, every one of them watching, every one of them able to notice a stranger. Dogs lay beneath the tables, their ears pricking at the scent of unfamiliar boots. Musicians scanned the crowd for applause, jesters for laughter, priests for signs of sin. To move in such a hall was like stepping into the light of a stage. One misstep and you were seen. So, how did an assassin approach such a task? With patience above all. He might pose as a servant, bribing a maid for a chance to carry trays. He might pose as a pilgrim seeking shelter at the castle chapel, or as a worker hired to repair a roof. Sometimes he hid for days in a cellar or even inside a barrel, cramped and cold, waiting for the right moment. It was not glamorous. It was uncomfortable, humiliating, and exhausting. Yet it was the only way to slip through the layers of stone and suspicion. There is another truth here too. Success was not measured by the strike itself, but by whether you vanished afterward. A lord stabbed in his chamber was not a victory if his guards found you a moment later. A poisoned goblet was not triumph if your hand was caught in the act. The challenge was not only reaching the target, but leaving behind nothing but confusion. A man found dead in the morning, a mystery whispered in the hall, a fear that spread but no face to blame. And so assassins lived in the long space between patience and panic, waiting in silence, holding their breath as footsteps passed by, memorizing the sound of doors, the creak of stairs, the cough of a guard who always paused near the corner. They were not warriors charging in with banners flying. They were shadows stretched thin across stone, fragile and fleeting. It is worth remembering too that castles themselves were not just military fortresses, they were homes. Children played in the courtyards, cooks bustled in the kitchens, priests muttered prayers in the chapels, dogs barked in the stables. To slip through this world meant slipping past life itself, past the rhythms of an entire household from the stable boy to the steward. Every one of them was a potential threat, not by force but by recognition. So, when we imagine the assassin's target, let us imagine not a lone man waiting to be struck, but an entire fortress of obstacles, walls and moats, guards and servants, suspicion and rumor. To reach the target was to pass through a labyrinth of human and stone defenses, each one ready to collapse upon the intruder. And in that moment, standing at the edge of the courtyard, dagger hidden beneath a cloak, the assassin must have felt the weight of impossibility. Not only the danger of the act itself, but the knowledge that even if he succeeded, he could never linger. His reward was not glory, not honor, not even the satisfaction of seeing his work recognized. His reward was the chance to flee before the walls closed in. To move unseen was never the same as being invisible. The medieval assassin knew that no cloak could render him transparent, no shadow could swallow him whole. He had only one real tool at his disposal, the art of appearing to belong. And belonging in a world obsessed with hierarchy and order was never simple. Disguise was not only a matter of cloth and paint, it was a study of human habit. If you wanted to slip into a castle, you did not simply put on the tunic of a servant. You learned how a servant walked shoulders, lowered eyes down a pace that hurried without ever drawing attention. You learned how a servant held a tray, how he bowed when passing through a hall, how he paused when spoken to by a knight. Clothing was only the surface. The body beneath it had to become something else. One of the oldest tricks was the pilgrim's staff. To dress as a pilgrim meant covering yourself in layers of dust and humility. Pilgrims were everywhere in medieval Europe, trudging along roads toward shrines in Santiago, Canterbury, or Rome. Their clothes were patched, their sandals worn, their eyes cast toward heaven. No one questioned why they were strangers, because a pilgrim was supposed to be a stranger. They carried badges, small tokens of saints, or holy places pinned to their cloaks. A shell from Santiago, a cross from Jerusalem, a token from Canterbury. If you bore such a badge, you were instantly recognized as a man of devotion, and devotion was a shield sharper than steel. But it was not without danger. To wear the pilgrim's cloak meant submitting to scrutiny from priests and monks. They might ask for prayers or proof of your journey. They might ask for stories from the shrine. If your tongue stumbled, your disguise crumbled. So an assassin learned not only to wear the cloak, but to carry the stories, to know which relic lay in which shrine, which miracle was said to have happened in which town. He became a collector of tales, as much as a collector of blades. Other disguises were less holy. The travelling minstrel, for instance, enjoyed freedom like few others. Minstrels moved from hall to hall, bringing music, jokes, and gossip. They were welcomed for the laughter they brought, the tunes they played on lute, or harp the verses they sang about distant battles. To wear the garb of a minstrel was to carry a license for movement. A stranger could appear at a feast, sit by the fire, and be asked to perform rather than to explain himself. It was in many ways the perfect mask, yet it carried its own traps. A minstrel was expected to perform. Could you play the strings with convincing skill? Could you sing without faltering? Could you recite verses in a tongue that fit the hall? If you could not, your cover lasted no longer than a single song. For this reason, some assassins were rumored to have trained in music, learning enough to pluck simple tunes, enough to pass as a humble, wandering entertainer. Others traveled in groups, hiding among genuine performers, using their noise as cover. And then there was the laborer's guise. To wear coarse wool, to carry tools, to bow your head and pretend to be one of the countless men who repaired walls, dug ditches, carried wood, or tended horses. Laborers were everywhere, and no lord could live without them. Yet this disguise too demanded skill. If you carried a hammer but held it like a pen, suspicion rose. If you tried to lead a horse but walked in fear of its teeth, you betrayed yourself. To be a laborer, you had to know the work, how to tighten a saddle strap, how to lift a bucket, how to walk with a stoop born of hours in the field. Sometimes the disguises grew stranger still. Monks with their shaved tonsures and dark robes moved freely across lands. They were welcomed at churches, abbeys, and even noble houses. But to pretend to be a monk was the most dangerous masquerade of all. It meant stepping into the role of holiness. People might ask you to bless a child, to speak a prayer, to quote scripture. To stumble over the words of a psalm could be your death. And yet there are whispers in the chronicles of men who donned the robe, their daggers hidden beneath the folds, their lips murmuring borrowed Latin until the moment they struck. We must not forget the simplest disguise of all to vanish into the crowd. In markets, in fairs, in cities where the streets were packed with bakers, cobblers, smiths, and fishmongers, no elaborate costume was needed. All you required was the look of weariness, the look of someone with errands to run and coin to count. Blend into the chatter, carry a basket, shout the name of fish or bread, and you became part of the human tide. An assassin could slip into a city this way, unnoticed, carried by the very mass of humanity. And yet every disguise was temporary. You could wear the pilgrim's staff only until someone asked about your shrine. You could strum a lute only until someone demanded a song you did not know. You could carry a laborer's tool only until someone asked you to swing it. A disguise bought you time, not safety. It created a window, and within that window you had to act. There is a deeper truth in all of this. These disguises tell us something about the world itself. They show us who was trusted, who was welcomed, who was invisible. Pilgrims were trusted because faith was powerful. Minstrels were welcomed because entertainment was valued. Servants and laborers were invisible because society did not look at them closely. An assassin exploited these truths. He turned the very assumptions of medieval society into weapons sharper than daggers. It was not only a performance for others, it was also a performance for the self. To put on the pilgrim's cloak was to take on humility, to bow your head and speak softly. To don the minstrel's garb was to smile, to gesture, to feign joy. To wear the labourer's wool was to bend your back, to mutter in the rough accents of the field. In the end, the assassin was not only an actor but a mirror reflecting the expectations of everyone he met. And when the disguise succeeded, when the pilgrim was waved through the gate, when the minstrel was offered a place by the fire, when the servant carried a tray into the hall, that was when the masquerade became most dangerous of all. Because at that moment the killer stood closer to the target than anyone suspected. He was not outside the walls, not waiting in the shadows. He was inside, smiling, bowing, serving. He had become part of the very household he intended to shatter. Steel is swift, but poison is patient. To use a blade was to risk being seen, to risk the cry of alarm and the clash of guards' swords. To use poison was to let death travel invisibly, to let it slip into the body of a man with his supper, with his wine, with the touch of his own fingers to his lips. And in the Middle Ages, poison carried with it not only danger but dread. To the medieval mind, poison was more than a substance. It was a corruption of nature, where a sword-cut clean poison was invisible, creeping, dishonest. It frightened people because it was hard to see, harder still to fight, and so the assassin who mastered it wielded more than a weapon, he wielded fear. The substances themselves were drawn from the same world that gave bread, wine, and healing herbs. Hemlock, with its tall stalks and delicate white flowers, grew in fields and along roadsides. It looked innocent, but its juice could still the heart and weaken the muscles until breathing itself failed. Belladonna, called deadly nightshade, bore glossy black berries that looked tempting to children but could stop them cold. Monkshood or wolfsbane sprouted with purple-blue flowers shaped like a hooded monk, beautiful to the eye and lethal to the blood. These plants were not rare. They grew in gardens, hedges, and meadows. What made them dangerous was knowledge of how much to use, how to prepare it, and how to deliver it unseen. Too little and the victim merely fell ill. Too much and the death came so swiftly that suspicion followed. The true skill lay in balance, in finding the dose that seemed like fever or weakness, not murder. The assassin had choices in method. There was the wine cup, perhaps the most common. A few drops of tincture stirred in when the servant looked away, when the torches flickered, when the feast was loud. The victim raised the cup in a toast, drank deeply, and swallowed death with cheer. Sometimes the wine was thick and spiced enough to hide any bitterness. Other times honey was used to mask the taste, or herbs to disguise the scent. Then there was food. Bread, cheese, stew, or roasted meat, any of these could carry poison. But food was more dangerous for the assassin than wine for the cook. Tasted the servants, tasted the dogs, sometimes tasted before the dish reached the lord. To poison food meant risking that the wrong mouth would swallow it first. And so the clever assassin often preferred the cup where the lord alone might drink. There were subtler ways still. Powders could be sprinkled on clothing or gloves. The skin, if cut or broken, absorbed the venom. An ointment could be rubbed on a saddle or a weapon's hilt, seeping slowly into the rider's hands until fever took him. The chronicles whisper of rings with hollow stones filled with poison, their wearer able to tip a drop into a dish with a flick of the hand. Some tales even speak of poisoned candles whose smoke, when inhaled over hours, weakened the body. Such stories may lean toward legend, but they reveal the fascination poison inspired a weapon that moved in silence, striking from within. But poisons were not always plants. Arsenic, white and tasteless, was known even then. It was called the king of poisons centuries later, but its power was no less in the medieval world. Powdered finely, it could vanish into drink or broth. Too much, and the victim wretched, violently betraying the act. Just enough, and the victim wasted away, his skin pale, his strength fading, his death appearing natural. Mercury, too, was known shimmering like liquid silver. Alchemists handled it with curiosity, but in careless hands it poisoned slowly, filling the body with sickness. Poison was feared because it could hide itself within time. A man might fall ill days after the feast or weeks after the first sip. People whispered of slow poisons, substances that did not kill at once but eroded the body gradually. Whether these were real or only imagination, the idea alone spread terror. Who could say if the ache in one's belly came from spoiled meat or from a rival's hand? Yet poison had its weaknesses. It was treacherous not only to the victim but to the wielder. The assassin who carried powders risked breathing them in. The one who prepared tinctures risked a drop on the tongue, a burn on the skin. Stories tell of poisoners who died by their own craft, betrayed by a mistake in measure or a careless gesture. And always there was suspicion. A lord who died too strangely left behind whispers, and those whispers could lead back to the hand that prepared his cup. For this reason, poison was often seen as the weapon of women or of cowards in the eyes of chroniclers. Knights despised it, for it denied the honor of combat. But that very disdain was its strength. Who would suspect a woman with a vial of herbs? Who would suspect a servant sprinkling powder, a physician offering a draught? Assassins knew this. They used the prejudices of their age as shield. There is a paradox here, and it is worth pausing over. The same herbs that could heal also killed. The same monk who knew how to ease pain might also know how to bring it. The line between apothecary and assassin was not always clear. To study medicine was in some ways to study death as well as life. And so the assassin who turned to poison was often at heart a student of nature, a dark mirror of the healer. And perhaps this is why poison was feared so deeply. A sword you could see, a bow you could hear. But poison came through trust, the trust in food, in drink, in medicine, in the body itself. To eat, to drink, to live, these were necessities. Poison made them dangerous, and in doing so it made the assassin's reach longer than any blade. Steel is loud, steel is quick, but poison whispers. If a dagger was the weapon of hot blood and urgency, then poison belonged to patience. It moved invisibly silent and creeping, requiring no clash of steel, no shout of alarm. In the medieval world, this silence made poison both alluring and terrifying. It was not only the act of killing that mattered, but the uncertainty that followed. One could never be entirely sure whether an illness was natural or whether an enemy's hand had guided it. To the medieval imagination, poison was almost supernatural. The sword might be an instrument of courage, but poison was regarded as unclean, a corruption of both body and soul. Writers of the age described it as a secret death, a killing that bypassed the chivalric codes of honor. Yet because it was despised, it was also powerful precisely because it struck where honor failed to defend. The plants of the field and forest gave as much danger as they gave nourishment. Hemlock, with its delicate white flowers, grew along roadsides and in meadows. To the untrained eye, it was no different from parsley, but its juice, once taken, slowly numbed the body until the lungs themselves forgot to breathe. Deadly nightshade or belladonna carried black berries so glossy and sweet-looking that children were tempted to taste them only to collapse soon after. Wolfsbane, with its violet hood-shaped flowers, adorned monastery gardens as an ornament, yet even the touch of its roots could burn the skin. The assassin's art was in the measure. Too much, and the victim convulsed in obvious agony, calling suspicion upon the act. Too little, and the victim lingered sick but alive. The true skill lay in balance, to make the dose seem like fever, like the weakness of age, like the exhaustion of travel. If a noble died in his bed with only a faint complaint of stomach pain, who could say whether it was food, fate, or malice? Wine was the favorite carrier. Its deep color and strong flavor hid almost anything. A few drops of tincture poured into a goblet could vanish without trace. The victim might raise his cup in a toast, drinking with laughter, never knowing that death had already slipped inside. Feasts were noisy torches, flickered servants bustled in that confusion. An assassin needed only a breath of time, a distraction, and the deed was done. Food was more dangerous, for many hands touched it before the Lord's servants tasted dishes. Dogs might be fed scraps, and cooks often sampled their own creations. Yet it was not impossible. Honey masked bitterness. Heavy spices like cinnamon or pepper disguised strange flavors. A roasted bird basted in sauce might carry more than meat to the table. There were more inventive methods. Powders could be sprinkled onto gloves, cloaks, or saddles. The skin, especially if nicked or rubbed raw, absorbed the poison slowly, leading to fevers days later. Chronicles even tell of rings with hollow jewels filled with venom. A twist of the stone, a flick of the hand, and a drop fell into the victim's cup unnoticed. Some accounts half-legend whisper of poisoned candles whose smoke over hours weakened the body. Whether true or not, these tales reveal the fear that poison carried the sense that it could travel anywhere, hiding in objects meant for daily life. Minerals too joined the assassin's arsenal. Arsenic, pale and tasteless, was feared for its ability to vanish into broths or wines without leaving a trace. Too much and the victim vomited violently. Just enough and he wasted away, pale, thin, as though struck by a wasting sickness. Mercury fascinated alchemists with its silver shimmer, yet prolonged exposure caused madness and trembling. To those who sought a slow and subtle death, it was a tempting tool. This was the true terror, the idea that poison might act slowly. A wound bled at once, a sword felled a man on the spot, but poison could linger, turning strong men weak over weeks, leaving families and courts uncertain. Was this a fever? Was it the hand of God? Or was it the hand of an enemy with herbs hidden in his pouch? Yet poison betrayed its wielder too. The one who prepared powders risked breathing them in. The one who mixed tinctures risked a drop upon the tongue, a splash upon the skin. Stories abound of poisoners who died by their own craft, undone by a careless slip. It was a weapon that demanded precision knowledge and the discipline to respect danger. Because poison denied open combat, chroniclers often described it as the weapon of the powerless. Knights despised it, kings banned it. But it was precisely for that reason that it was useful. The weak, the overlooked, the underestimated, they could wield poison as easily as any sword. A servant carrying a tray, a wife offering a cup, a physician preparing a remedy, these figures could slip past suspicion. The prejudice of the age, which assumed only men fought openly, became a shield for those who killed quietly. And here lies a strange truth. The same plants that killed also healed. Belladonna in small doses eased muscle spasms. Monkshood numbed pain. Hemlock was used in ointments for joints. The apothecary and the assassin studied the same leaves, the same roots, the same powders. One used them to prolong life, the other to shorten it. The line between medicine and murder was thinner than most dared to admit. Imagine the atmosphere. A noble sits at his long table, candles flickering, laughter rising. The goblets clink together in a toast. Outside, snow gathers in the courtyard. Inside, the cup brims with wine rich and spiced. No one notices the servant's slight pause, the faint sheen on the rim of the goblet. Hours later, the noble complains of heat, of cramping pain. By morning, he is dead, and no blade has been drawn. Poison reshaped the landscape of fear. To wield it was to turn daily life, eating, drinking, even wearing clothes, into danger. And perhaps this is why medieval people spoke of it with dread. For it was not merely a weapon. It was betrayal made, liquid distrust made tangible. It was the knowledge that one's own body could be turned against itself. That completes part 8. Would you like me to move forward to part 9, the assassin's blade, next, where we shift back from hidden powders to steel daggers and the intimate craft of close-quarter killing? Bandanoi write part chin saungin characters chat GPT danoi. Here is part 9. The assassin's blade, written in the same calm, immersive tone, carefully expanded to about 6,000 characters. Part 9. The assassin's blade. If poison was the patient whisper, then the dagger was the close breath against the ear. Where powders dissolved in wine and herbs slipped into broth, the blade demanded presence. The assassin must come near, must reach into the fragile circle of another person's body. It was not distance, not sorcery, not deception carried by the unseen. It was steel skin and silence. Daggers in the medieval world were as common as belts. They were tools as much as weapons used for cutting meat, mending straps, even whittling wood by the fire. But in the hands of an assassin, the everyday tool became something far sharper than its edge. It became a promise of intimacy, of finality. Unlike a knight's sword, long and gleaming meant to be displayed, the dagger was hidden. Short, narrow, sometimes no more than a palm's length, it slid beneath cloaks tucked into boots or rested against the thigh under robes. Some were single-edged for slicing, others double-edged for thrusting their points, designed to slip between ribs or pierce chainmail at its weaker joins. A few were curved like a claw meant to hook into flesh and pull. The art of the assassin's blade was not in the cut, but in the timing. Steel could not be poured into a goblet hours before. It demanded the assassin to be there in that moment with steady hands and a steady heart. It meant waiting sometimes for hours in corners or doorways behind curtains or in alleys until the victim was isolated, distracted or vulnerable. In crowded places, daggers struck under the veil of commotion. A festival, a market, a procession, all noise, all movement. One shove, one jostle, and a blade slipped forward, its work done in a heartbeat. The victim staggered, confused, not even certain what had happened, until the warm bloom of blood spread beneath his tunic. The crowd, unaware, carried on its laughter, its songs, while a man sank to the cobbles. But the most chilling stories speak of assassins who struck not in chaos but in quiet. A chamber at night, the only sound, the breathing of the sleeper. A chapel corner hushed with prayer. A corridor where torchlight trembled and footsteps echoed against stone. In such silence, the strike was not hidden by noise but sharpened by it. The blade became the only sound, the gasp that followed its plunge, the only reply. Chroniclers described how assassins often aimed for specific places on the body. The throat quick to silence. The lower ribs where organs lay unarmored. The spine reached from behind to drop a man instantly. There were no rules of combat here, no honor to uphold. It was not about a duel, it was about certainty, and certainty required practice. Many assassins were said to have trained in animal butchery, learning how flesh gave way, how bones resisted, how quickly blood followed. Some practiced with pigs whose bodies resembled the human frame in texture. They learned that a thrust upward beneath the breastbone could find the heart, that a sideways cut at the neck severed not only veins but also the fragile cord of breath. Yet no matter how skilled the blade was risky. Unlike poison which left its wielder at a distance, the dagger placed the killer in peril. There was always the chance of a shout, of a struggle, of a retainer bursting in. There was always the risk that the victim, even fatally wounded, would lash out and drag the assassin down with him. For this reason, blades were often paired with speed of escape, hidden doors, waiting horses, alleys mapped in advance. Certain groups in medieval history became notorious for their mastery of the dagger. The Nizari Ismailis, remembered in European chronicles as the assassins, were said to slip into tents or palaces and kill only the chosen victim, leaving all others unharmed. Their method was not to sow chaos, but to send a message carved into flesh, reminding rulers that they were never safe, not even in the heart of their power. Whether legend exaggerated their skill or not, the reputation itself was enough to bend the wills of kings. But blades were not always wielded by shadowy orders. Sometimes it was a servant bribed with coin, sometimes a spurned lover driven by passion, sometimes even a family member hoping to clear the path to inheritance. The dagger did not belong to any one class of killer. It belonged to anyone desperate, cunning, or reckless enough to carry it. The tools varied. Some were ordinary knives stolen from kitchens, others were crafted with care, slim and double-edged, designed to pierce armor gaps. Certain Italian stiletto daggers became infamous, their points so narrow that they could pass through mail links with precision. In Germany, the bollock dagger, named for its hilt shape, served both as a common sidearm and as a weapon for sudden thrusts. The diversity of daggers meant that a blade could be improvised or professional, rustic or refined. One detail often overlooked is how assassins approached. Rarely was it a leap or a rush. More often it was a slow, calculated nearness pretending to serve wine to assist with a cloak to bow in respect. The blade was drawn not with a flourish but with a whisper of motion hidden in the natural flow of service or ceremony. To the victim, the killer's hand seemed harmless until it was already too late. Picture a medieval banquet hall. The torches spit, the dogs gnaw at bones under the tables, and lords laugh with mouths full of meat. A servant bends low, setting down a dish. His hand slips beneath his robe, and in the same motion he rises, but not with food. The dagger flashes once quick as a blink. A lord gasps, clutches his side, and collapses onto the rushes. By the time the hall realizes the servant is gone, swallowed by the crowd or out into the night. Or imagine the darkness of a castle corridor. A lone noble walks his candle, casting long shadows on the stone. From behind a tapestry a hand emerges and steel follows. The candle drops, the flame sputters out. And in the sudden dark the only sound is the rattle of breath fading into silence. The assassin's blade was intimate in a way poison could never be. It demanded closeness. It demanded nerve. It demanded that the killer feel the warmth of the victim, hear the last exhalation, and sometimes meet the eyes of the dying. That intimacy gave it a kind of terrible power and also a terrible risk. Because of this, blades became symbols of both fear and fascination. Songs warned of them. Laws banned the carrying of hidden daggers in cities. Priests preached against them, yet still they remained as common as the belt knives worn by every traveller. For in the end, the assassin's blade was not a strange or exotic weapon. It was ordinary, and that was what made it so dangerous. That completes part 9. Would you like me to move into part 10, the cloak of disguise, where we explore how assassins avoided suspicion not only through weapons but through appearance, costume and performance? Bạn đã nói right, part 16.000 characters ChatGPT đã nói. Here is part 10, the cloak of disguise, written in the same calm, immersive tone, carefully expanded to about 6,000 characters. Part 10, the cloak of disguise. If the dagger was the intimate breath of death and poison the quiet murmur, then disguise was the veil. It was not a weapon of steel or herb, but of illusion, of misdirection. To vanish in plain sight, to walk unseen, not because one was invisible, but because one was unremarkable. This was the assassin's truest defense. In the medieval world, where social order was stitched into fabric and gesture, clothing was never just clothing. A man in a knight's surcoat marked with heraldic colours was a banner as much as a body. A peasant in rough homespun was immediately placed at the bottom rung of the ladder, his speech and stance announcing his station even before his words. A monk's robe conferred sanctity, a merchant's cloak suggested coin, a servant's apron carried the expectation of obedience. To slip between these identities was to wield the greatest camouflage available, the assumptions of others. Assassins learned to drape themselves in these borrowed skins. A killer might don the brown habit of a friarhead, bowed hands tucked into wide sleeves, moving silently through a cloistered courtyard. Who would question a humble brother carrying a message, a loaf of bread, a folded letter? Another might dress as a soldier, blending with the bustle of guards, his sword at his side, indistinguishable from theirs. Still another might take the garb of a servant, entering chambers without notice, carrying a jug of wine or a tray of fruit, the very props of his concealment. European chronicles tell of killers who entered castles dressed as pilgrims, their cloaks patched and dusty, their staffs marked with badges of distant shrines. The medieval world revered pilgrims. Doors opened for them, food was offered, suspicion was minimal. What better disguise than one that not only concealed but invited welcome? In the great cities too, anonymity was a cloak of its own. Markets thronged with people of every kind, their clothing a mosaic of colours and fabrics. Amid such press, an assassin could move unnoticed, his face just one among many, his cloak just another patch in the tapestry of the crowd. Disguise here was not about pretending to be someone specific, but about vanishing into the ordinary. But disguise was not only fabric, it was posture, movement, voice. A nobleman slouched and muttered, and suddenly he was mistaken for a servant. A servant straightened, adopted a firm stride, and people parted, believing him someone of rank. The assassin's art was to observe how others carried themselves, and then mimic it to slip into roles as easily as slipping into borrowed shoes. Consider the assassin disguised as a merchant. He would learn the words of trade, the gestures of weighing coins, the habit of praising wares. His cloak might be lined with pouches, some real, others empty, to mimic the bulges of goods. He would carry ledgers marked with meaningless scribbles, just enough to pass a casual glance. The dagger at his belt, hidden under folds of cloth, would be the only truth. The medieval stage itself offered inspiration. Travelling players, mummers, and jongleurs were masters of transformation. With painted faces and quick costume changes, they shifted from king to peasant, from devil to saint in the blink of an eye. Assassins too borrowed this art of role-play, though their performance had only one audience, the victim. Sometimes the disguise was elaborate. An assassin might spend days or weeks preparing, adopting a false identity, embedding himself in the routines of a household or a court. Servants grew used to his presence, guards grew accustomed to his face. And then at the chosen moment the mask dropped, not with the removal of cloth, but with the reveal of steel. Other times disguise was fleeting. A cloak pulled around the face, a hood drawn low, a scarf covering the mouth. In such cases the goal was not to blend in beforehand, but to escape afterward. A man fleeing down an alley could throw off a cloak, turn it inside out, and emerge as someone entirely different. Pursuers, expecting the colour of one garment, overlooked the man now clad in another. There were even stories of women assassins who used gender itself as disguise. In a society where women were often underestimated or overlooked, a woman could pass more easily into chambers or approach without suspicion. She might pose as a washerwoman, a nurse, or a midwife, roles that placed her close to the private spaces of life. In her basket might lie linens, herbs, or bandages, or perhaps something sharper waiting. Cultural differences shaped disguise too. In the courts of the Middle East, turbans and flowing robes offered ample concealment. In Italy, with its carnivals and masked festivals, anonymity could be found in plain sight beneath painted visages. Venice especially became famous for its masks worn openly in certain seasons, where faces blurred into one another in a sea of colour. In such places, the assassin could move with even greater freedom, his identity dissolved into the festival crowd. But for all the stories of disguise, one truth remained: it relied upon the blindness of assumption. People saw what they expected to see. A friar with his head down, surely harmless. A servant with a tray, surely obedient. A pilgrim, surely blessed. The assassin's cloak of disguise was stitched from the fabric of trust, and trust was the most fragile thread of all. Picture, if you will, a cold morning outside a castle gate. The guards yawn, their cloaks wrapped tightly, their breath fogging in the air. A pilgrim approaches, staff in hand, cloak-patched sandals worn thin. He bows his head, murmurs of St. James on his lips. The guards nod, wave him through. He passes under the arch footsteps, echoing on stone, and beneath the cloak against his ribs lies the slender weight of a dagger. Or imagine the bustle of a noble wedding feast. Servants hurry with platters of roasted meat, jugs of wine, baskets of bread. Among them moves one more figure, his hair covered by a cap, his eyes lowered. He sets down a tray, bows, steps back. No one notices the brief pause, the hand lingering too long on the handle of a jug. In the next moment, the cup that noble lifts to his lips will be his last. The cloak of disguise was not always literal fabric. It was the art of becoming what others ignored. To be invisible not by vanishing, but by becoming ordinary. To stand beside a man and have him never wonder who you were until it was too late. And so disguise was as potent a weapon as any dagger or vial. It turned suspicion into blindness, proximity into opportunity. It was the assassin's truest armor, not made of steel but of shadows, the shadows not of night but of expectation. If disguise was the cloak of daylight, then the night itself was the cloak of heaven. Darkness, with its deep folds of shadow and its muffled silence, offered a canvas upon which assassins could move almost unseen. In the medieval world where the glow of a candle was the brightest comfort and moonlight, the only street lamp the night was more than a time of rest. It was a shifting world of uncertain outlines, a realm where sound carried far and fear carried farther. Life in those centuries was tied to the rhythm of the sun. Most people rose at dawn, worked until dusk, and then retreated to their homes as darkness fell. Candles and oil lamps were costly. Even among the wealthy they were used sparingly. Villages at night grew quiet houses, shuttered fires dimmed only a dog's bark or the call of an owl breaking the hush. Cities too were subdued once the sun sank. Gates closed, markets stilled, and watchmen patrolled, streets now cloaked in shadow. The night was not a place of activity but of retreat, and in this retreat lay opportunity. For the assassin night was ally, shield, and accomplice. Darkness concealed movement, blurred features, and dulled recognition. Where daylight exposed, night concealed. A man who could not walk through a hall unnoticed at noon might glide through it unseen at midnight. A figure crossing a courtyard in the silver light of the moon might be mistaken for a servant, a ghost, or simply overlooked altogether. The art of moving at night required not only silence of step, but silence of breath, of presence. Assassins trained themselves to feel the rhythm of their own bodies, to pace steps with the wind, to pause when a dog stirred, to move only when the sound of leaves masked the crunch of gravel. In the stillness of medieval towns, where even a cough could be heard down a lane, such control was essential. Architecture, too, was an accomplice. Castles were built with narrow passages, twisting stairs, and hidden posterns, small doors set into walls for emergencies. A man who knew them could pass unseen, entering or leaving without ever facing the great gate. Monasteries and manor houses had cloisters, kitchens, and servants' corridors. These back ways, unlit and unguarded at night, offered routes for those who needed to move without notice. The cover of darkness also aided in approach. To travel by day risked recognition, especially for one not of the place. But by night, an assassin could journey along hedgerows, through woods, or across fields, arriving unseen at the outskirts of a target's home. Villages often lacked walls, and even when towns were enclosed, fields and gardens outside provided shadows enough. Imagine for a moment a walled city in France. The gates close at sundown. Torches flicker by the main entrance, but beyond the walls fall into blackness. An assassin waits in a thicket, listening to the guards' footsteps along the ramparts. When a cloud drapes across the moon, he moves. A rope is cast, a silent climb begins. Within moments he is overpressed into the darkness of the street below, where only cats wander. Or picture an English manor house, its halls still echoing with the laughter of a feast now ended. Lords and ladies have retired, the servants cleared the tables. A few candles burn low sputtering wax onto wooden sconces. The rest of the house is plunged into quiet. Outside, the fields lie silvered by frost. An assassin waits until even the last murmur dies. Then, through a postern door, he slips into the hall, each footstep careful on the flagstones. The fire has burned low, casting only embers. His shadow melts into shadow. Silence was as critical as darkness. The world of the Middle Ages was attuned to sound. A creak of timber, a dropped utensil, even the rustle of cloth could betray presence. Monks trained to rise for prayer at midnight walked with deliberate quiet, and assassins, too, learned to master their steps. Soft shoes of felt or leather, a cloth wrapped around a weapon to prevent clinking, even the control of breath, all these details shaped the ability to pass without notice. There were, of course, risks. Night was not only the domain of assassins, but of watchmen, thieves, and spirits imagined in every shadow. People feared the dark, believing it thick with ghosts and demons. For an assassin, this fear was both shield and hazard. Shield because suspicion was often muted at night. A strange sound might be dismissed as wind or a wandering soul. Hazard because a startled guard might strike out blindly, more from fear than recognition. Cultural traditions deepened this interplay of night and fear. In many parts of Europe, the hours after midnight were called the witching time, believed to be when the barrier between worlds thinned. To walk, then, was to tempt fate. Assassins moving in such hours wrapped themselves not only in shadow but in superstition. A guard who glimpsed a cloaked figure at that time might cross himself, mutter a prayer, and hurry away, convinced he had seen something not of this world. The assassin's passage, ironically, was eased by the very fears that haunted the night. In cities like Venice, the canals offered another dimension of nocturnal movement. A gondola gliding silently under bridges, oars muffled with cloth, could bring a figure to a palace unnoticed. The water carried sound differently, but it also carried one swiftly under the cover of night and fog. Likewise, in the East, assassins of the Persian or Ottoman courts might slip along garden paths lined with cypress trees, their silhouettes vanishing against the dark foliage. One must also recall that in these centuries the stars and the moon were brighter guides than we know today. With no haze of modern light, the night sky was a map in itself. Travelers could navigate by constellations, and assassins too used the moon's cycle. A new moon, when the sky was darkest, offered deepest cover. A full moon, though bright, gave shadows sharp enough to hide within if one knew how to use them. In every tale of the assassin's craft, the night returns as a silent partner. It was not merely the absence of day, but a realm with its own rules, its own textures. Footsteps on damp earth, the smell of smoke lingering from hearths, the distant hoot of an owl, all these were part of the assassin's stage. To move within it required not only skill but patience, an attunement to rhythm, the rhythm of silence, the rhythm of darkness, the rhythm of lives folded into sleep. And so the night became more than time. It became a weapon, a veil that could not be grasped, a cloak that cost nothing, a companion whose loyalty never wavered. The assassin stepped into it and was made less than a shadow, more than a whisper. A presence only in the moment of revelation, when steel caught the faint gleam of starlight. For those who lived in the medieval world, night was a time of vulnerability, of lowered guard, of trust in walls and doors. For the assassin, it was the stage upon which the final act was written, a stage where silence spoke louder than words, and darkness proved brighter than daylight in its promise of concealment. The silent night patient enveloping eternal was the assassin's greatest accomplice. Before a blade could be drawn, before a step was ever taken in shadow, there was the whisper. It was the whisper that prepared the way, the whisper that laid out the path, the whisper that placed one human life in the hands of another. In the medieval world, information was not only power, it was the true weapon that allowed assassins to move unseen and strike with certainty. The assassin was never an isolated figure. However silent his approach, however solitary his act, he moved along invisible threads spun by others. Spies, messengers, and informants formed a web that stretched across courts and markets, across taverns and monasteries, even across borders. To know where a man slept, what hour he prayed, which servant he trusted, or which feast he would attend, was to hold his life in suspension. Consider the life of a medieval court. A king sat upon his throne, surrounded by nobles, clerics, and servants. Each of these people carried knowledge, whether they intended to or not. The servant who poured the wine saw which goblet was chosen most often. The maid who tended the chamber knew which locks were sturdy and which were broken. The scribe who copied letters knew which lords were in favour and which in disgrace. All of these details were fragments of a puzzle, and to the careful ear they could be gathered, assembled, and sold. Assassins' guilds, when they existed, often relied on this vast undercurrent of human observation. Spies might not even know the full weight of what they carried. A tavern keeper in Florence overhearing a mercenary's grumble, a washerwoman in Paris noticing her master's departure time, a stable boy in Damascus marking which horses were saddled at dawn. All these small details, insignificant alone, form a map when brought together. The web of spies was not always formal. In truth, it often resembled gossip flowing from mouth to mouth, reshaped as it travelled. Yet even gossip carried truth. A nobleman rumoured to have taken a new mistress might be distracted, less guarded, more vulnerable. A bishop whispered to be ill might not attend vespers, altering a routine long established. An assassin listening to such tales heard more than idle chatter. He heard opportunities woven in casual words. Merchants and travelers were vital threads. Moving between cities, they carried more than goods. They carried observations. In Venice, a trader from the Levant might note which senator returned late at night. In Cairo, a merchant from the Maghreb might speak of a general's new palace. Such travelers, often regarded as outsiders, blended easily into the background, their presence expected and unremarkable. Yet their words fed networks stretching across kingdoms. Messengers, too, were crucial. The world before telegraph or telephone depended on letters carried by hand. To intercept a letter was to intercept a secret. To delay a message was to shift the timing of an event. Assassins' patrons, kings, rival nobles, even guild leaders often paid heavily for such control. A rider on the road stopped by bandits who were not truly bandits might lose not only his purse but the future safety of his master. One must imagine the steady pulse of communication in those centuries. Couriers galloped along Roman roads still in use or trudged on foot across muddy lanes. Monks carried messages between monasteries, knights bore letters sealed with wax, merchants folded scraps of paper into their wares. Along this network, whispers travelled just as surely as swords. Assassins, like spiders, waited in the centre, feeling each vibration. Spies did not always serve willingly. Some were pressed, blackmailed, or threatened. A servant might be caught stealing and offered release in exchange for secrets. A guard might owe gambling debts and pay them not in coin but in knowledge of patrol schedules. Others were persuaded by coin alone. A bag of silver could loosen even the most loyal tongue. In societies where wealth determined survival, the promise of gold outweighed fidelity to masters. In the Islamic world, particularly during the time of the Nizari Ismailis, whose name became synonymous with the very word assassin, the web of informants was said to be vast. Gardens, marketplaces, and caravanserais buzzed with words that found their way back to mountain fortresses. The old man of the mountain, as European chroniclers called him, relied not only on fanatical loyalty but on constant streams of intelligence. His followers knew when a vizier left his palace, which route he took, and which guards were most easily bribed. Europe had its parallels. In the courts of France and England, rival factions often employed spies to undermine each other. A noblewoman's maid might whisper to another household. A friar might carry confessions too freely shared. A scribe might leave a copy of a letter where the wrong eyes could find it. This constant flow of information meant that no lord was entirely secure. To be powerful was to be observed, and to be observed was to be vulnerable. Yet the most insidious part of the web was its invisibility. A man never knew whether the person before him was loyal or listening for another. Trust itself was fragile. Kings might test their servants by spreading false information, waiting to see where it resurfaced. Merchants might invent prices to test rivals' honesty. Even within families, suspicion crept in. The assassin did not need to sow distrust. He merely thrived in its soil. Imagine now the perspective of the assassin preparing his task. He does not simply march to a door and strike. Weeks, even months, might be spent listening, waiting, collecting whispers. He learns when the master of the house takes his evening walk, when the guards change shift, which physician visits, which cook prepares which dish. By the time the blade is drawn, the act is almost inevitable, as if the web itself has guided his hand. The web of spies was therefore the truest weapon. Blades dulled poisons, faded disguises, risked discovery. But knowledge endured. Knowledge turned every bolt and lock into paper, every wall into parchment. Knowledge made the assassin's path not only possible but inevitable. And in the end, the victim rarely understood how the moment came. He might look upon his assassin and wonder, how did you find me? How did you know? How did you pass unseen? The answer was simple and terrible. It was never only the assassin. It was the web spun by countless hands, invisible until the final strand tightened. The image of the assassin in the medieval world often brings to mind a hooded figure blade, gleaming, poised to strike. Yet the truth is quieter, more subtle, and in many ways more unsettling. The weapons of precision that served these shadowy figures were not always grand swords or fearsome axes, but small practical tools designed to slip past attention. Theirs was not the warfare of banners and trumpets, but of whispers and shadows, where the right weapon meant not strength but precision, control, and silence. The dagger was the most common, yet not all daggers were alike. Some were broad-bladed, meant for swift work, while others were slender and tapered, able to slide between ribs or beneath layers of cloth without leaving an obvious wound. Many were crafted with narrow hilts that allowed easy concealment beneath sleeves or cloaks. A traveller's dagger might look no different from that carried by any merchant on the road, but in the assassin's hand it was chosen with care, light enough to hide, sharp enough to finish swiftly, and sturdy enough not to betray its master. Then there was the stiletto, a weapon born in the workshops of Italy. Long, thin, and needle-like, it was less a blade for cutting than for piercing. Its purpose was not to clash in duels, but to strike with sudden precision. A thrust from a stiletto left little evidence, no great wound, no splatter to call alarm. In the alleyways of Renaissance cities, such a weapon was feared more than the swords of bravos, for it spoke of purpose, of calculation, of intent, hidden until the moment of impact. But not every weapon was of steel. The garrote, a simple cord or strip of cloth, served its purpose in silence. Often carried folded within a belt or disguised as part of clothing, it transformed in the assassin's hands into an instrument of control. To imagine such a tool is to imagine a world where sound itself must be avoided, where the clang of metal, the cry of alarm, or the rush of footsteps could ruin months of preparation. The garrote answered this demand with quiet inevitability. Poisons, too, were weapons of precision, though they demanded patience. Unlike blades, poisons did not strike in an instant. They seeped into food, into wine, into ointments or incense. Some acted swiftly, others only after days, leaving the victim weak, ill, and vulnerable before the final act. Medieval texts, from herbals to apothecaries' manuals, contain warnings cloaked in careful phrasing: plants too strong to be consumed, powders that must never be inhaled, minerals dangerous if touched with damp hands. Such warnings were not lost on those who sought darker uses. The challenge with poison was not in finding it, for nature offered abundance, but in administering it unseen. Cooks were watched, wine was tasted, and servants bore suspicion. To introduce poison required timing, subtlety, and often collusion. A trusted cupbearer, persuaded by gold or by threat, could transform a feast into a battlefield without swords drawn. Yet poison was unpredictable, and for that reason not all assassins relied upon it. Too much, and suspicion was certain; too little, and the victim survived, wary and alert. Precision here meant not merely the substance, but the measure, a delicate balance of craft. There were also weapons of deception. A ring with a hollow bezel could conceal powder or liquid, ready to be dropped into a goblet at a moment's distraction. A cane or walking staff might hide a slender blade within, drawn with a twist of the hand. Even a book might be carved to hold a dagger carried openly into a chamber where swords were forbidden. These were not the tools of soldiers, but of artists in secrecy, blending the ordinary with the extraordinary until the line between them disappeared. Archery offered its own methods, though less often in close quarters. A crossbow small enough to conceal could be carried into alleys or courtyards. Unlike the longbow, which demanded strength and open space, the crossbow could be cocked in advance, held steady and loosed at the chosen moment. Some even used bolts tipped with poisons or designed to shatter, leaving fragments within. Yet to fire a crossbow was loud, disruptive, and final. For this reason, it was less favoured in the subtle art of assassination, though more than one ruler met his end by a quarrel fired from a darkened window. One must also consider the tools that were not weapons at all, at least not in the eyes of most. A set of lockpicks hidden in a pouch was as vital as a blade. Wax impressions of keys made when a guard's ring of iron was left upon a table opened doors that otherwise seemed unassailable. Chalk and charcoal used to mark paths or signal allies became instruments of movement and coordination. Rope hooks, even simple nails, all of these were as much a part of the assassin's arsenal as steel or poison. And then there was the mind itself, the greatest weapon of precision. The assassin's true advantage lay not only in what he carried, but in what he perceived. He watched, he listened, he remembered. The placement of guards, the rhythm of bells, the flicker of candles in windows all became part of a mental map sharper than any blade. When the moment came, the physical weapon was only the final stroke. The true work had been done long before in observation, in calculation, in patience. In many ways, these weapons reveal the assassin not as a brute but as a craftsman. Each tool was chosen not for its grandeur but for its ability to fit the moment. A dagger might be too loud for one occasion, too slow for another. A poison might serve where steel could not, and silence might serve where both failed. To look upon the weapons of precision is to glimpse a philosophy that power does not always shout, that control does not always gleam, that the smallest gesture can carry the greatest consequence. For the medieval assassin, then, weapons were not merely objects. They were extensions of a principal act, unseen strike, once leave nothing behind but silence. And in that silence, power shifted, thrones toppled, and history itself was rewritten by hands that remained more often than not anonymous. Would you like me to continue with part 14, Training and Discipline, where we explore how assassins learned patience, focus, and mental conditioning rather than only physical skill? Bạn đã nói right part 14,000 characters chat GPT đã nói. Here is part 14, Training and Discipline, written in the same immersive, calming style around 6,000 characters. Part 14, Training and Discipline. To imagine a medieval assassin is to imagine not just a shadow with a blade, but a mind and body carefully conditioned to a life of patience, silence, and endurance. These figures did not simply appear from nowhere, nor were they merely outlaws who stumbled into killing for coin. Behind their work was training, sometimes formal, sometimes improvised, but always rooted in discipline. The discipline of waiting, the discipline of listening, and the discipline of controlling one's own impulses, these were the true foundations of their craft. Training began not with weapons, but with awareness. To move unseen through a medieval town, one needed to know how sound carried across cobblestones, how lamplight fell on walls, how a door hinge creaked at different hours of the night. Apprentices were often taught to spend long hours watching streets or courtyards, noting the smallest details. How many steps did the guard take before turning, which windows remained lit after midnight, which servant stopped to gossip and which kept to his duties? The assassin's first lesson was that every detail mattered, and to miss one was to invite failure. Physical training came next, but again it differed from that of soldiers. Knights practiced with sword and lance training to fight in open combat. Assassins trained in silence, in economy of movement. They practiced climbing walls not for sport but for survival. They learned to hold their breath, to move their feet lightly even across uneven ground, to fall without noise when balance was lost. Some schools of thought emphasized walking barefoot on gravel or stone, teaching sensitivity to every surface. Others practiced in darkness, moving through rooms without candles until the body knew its surroundings as well as the eyes. Endurance was critical. A knight might fight in a clash that lasted minutes, but an assassin might wait for hours in a cramped alcove or lie still for an entire night upon a rooftop. To endure cold, hunger, and discomfort without movement was part of their training. Monks in monasteries practiced discipline of the body for spiritual reasons, but assassins practiced it for survival. Both shared the same quiet acceptance of discomfort, the same insistence that the body must obey the will. Mental discipline was perhaps the hardest to cultivate. To strike at a target often required resisting countless impulses. The chance might appear early, yet too exposed. A victim might pass within arm's reach, yet with too many witnesses. The assassin learned to resist, to wait, to master impatience. One story told of initiates being placed in crowded markets with a simple task: follow a man through the stalls without being noticed, not for minutes but for an entire day. The challenge was not only to remain unseen but to keep focus through boredom, hunger, and distraction. Failure meant starting again the next day. Control of fear was another necessity. Few human beings can face the possibility of death without trembling. To enter a guarded palace, to slip into a nobleman's chamber, was to place oneself on the edge of survival. Training sought to confront this fear before the true test came. Some exercises were deliberately harsh initiates left in graveyards at night, expected to remain without flinching. Others forced to hold their hand steady while a candle burned close, testing their ability to resist panic. These were not games, but rehearsals for moments when hesitation meant discovery. Weapons training, though essential, came last. The assassin was not taught to fight prolonged battles, but to strike with efficiency. Dagger thrusts were practiced over and over until they became instinctive. Not flourishes, not dueling stances, but quick, direct motions meant to end life before a cry escaped. With Garrities, they practiced on weighted sacks until grip and pull were second nature. With poisons, they studied plants, minerals, and powders, learning not only how to apply them, but how to avoid being betrayed by their own hand. Here again, discipline was not about glory, but about control. Deception, too, was part of training. The ability to assume roles servant, merchant, pilgrim required more than costume. It required the bearing, speech, and habits of such people. An assassin might spend weeks living as a beggar, learning how to hold out a hand in just the right way, how to avoid the eyes of the wealthy while seeking the trust of the poor. Another might practice walking as a soldier, heavy-footed and stern, until he could pass through a gate without question. In this sense, training was as much theatrical as martial, for the assassin's stage was the streets, and his audience the unaware. One cannot overlook the role of secrecy in training. Unlike knights who trained openly in yards or craftsmen who learned in guild halls, assassins often trained in hidden courtyards, secluded gardens, or abandoned buildings. Their craft could not be displayed without risk. Knowledge was passed carefully master to apprentice, often in whispers or coded instruction. To learn this discipline was not only to acquire skills, but to enter into a pact of silence. Betrayal of methods could mean death, for secrecy was the shield that protected the entire order. There was also a moral discipline, though it may seem paradoxical. While many might imagine assassins as lawless, their craft often imposed strict rules: strike only the chosen target, avoid harm to the innocent, do not indulge in cruelty or excess. The discipline here was not kindness, but focus. To act without restraint was to draw attention, to break the illusion of control. Precision demanded boundaries, and training instilled them with the same severity as any physical exercise. What emerges from these practices is a picture of the assassin as a figure of restraint rather than chaos. His training was not in wild violence, but in measured action. Each step, each breath, each strike was part of a discipline that began long before the mission and ended long after. In a sense, the assassin was closer to the monk than to the soldier, one trained in silence, endurance, and control of the self. The difference lay not in the discipline itself, but in the end to which it was turned. And so we see that the assassin's true training was not about how to kill, but about how to remain unseen, unheard, unshaken. The blade was only the last tool. The real weapon was discipline, the ability to master body, mind, and will in service of a single hidden act. And that discipline, like a shadow at dusk, stretched far longer than any strike. Would you like me to continue with part 15? Networks and brotherhoods, exploring how assassins did not always act alone, but relied on webs of allies, informants, and silent brotherhoods. Bạn đã nói right part 15 6,000 characters ChatGPT đã nói. Here is part 15. Networks and brotherhoods, written in the same calming, immersive style, around 6,000 characters. Part 15. Networks and brotherhoods. To picture an assassin, one often imagines a solitary figure. A hood pulled low, a lone shadow slipping through alleys, working in silence and disappearing without trace. But this is only part of the truth. The assassin was rarely an entirely isolated being. Behind the apparent solitude lay networks, brotherhoods, and webs of trust that supported, shielded, and enabled the work. In the medieval world, no craft survived without a structure, and assassination was no exception. These networks were not grand armies or openly declared guilds, but they were carefully maintained ties that allowed survival in hostile landscapes. An assassin moving across regions required shelter, safe passage, information, and tools. Alone, he was vulnerable. Within a network, he was part of something larger, a hidden society that could stretch across towns, kingdoms, even empires. Some networks were rooted in kinship. Families that had practiced covert work for generations created silent lineages of knowledge. Fathers passed skills to sons, brothers shielded one another, cousins became informants within markets and taverns. Such family ties offered strength, but they also demanded loyalty. To betray the brotherhood was not to risk only one's own life, but to endanger blood relatives, and that weight was often enough to bind members in silence. Other networks formed around shared oaths. Small circles of men and women drawn from varied walks of life bound themselves to one another with promises of secrecy and mutual aid. These might meet in hidden chambers in the back rooms of inns, or in forgotten chapels at the edge of towns. A single candle, a shared cup of wine, and an oath sworn upon it could forge ties as strong as steel. In some tales, initiates would cut a finger and let a drop of blood fall into the cup, drinking it as a sign of unbreakable bond. These oaths were not symbolic only. They became the very law by which the group lived and died. Within these brotherhoods, each person had a role. One might be the blade skilled in the act itself. Another might be the whisperer gathering news from courts and markets. Another could be the fixer securing safe houses and disguises. Others yet worked as healers tending wounds sustained during missions, or as merchants supplying poisons hidden among herbs and spices. Together they formed a body with many parts, each essential to the whole. Informants were an especially vital part of the network. Tavern keepers, washerwomen, stable boys, all those who saw much but were often overlooked by nobles could be brought into service. A coin here, a favor there, a promise of protection, and suddenly the assassin's eyes and ears extended across an entire town. A stable boy might note when a lord's horse was saddled for a secret journey. A laundress might observe strange stains on a tunic. A guard might whisper which gate was unlocked at midnight. No detail was too small, and in the network every fragment of knowledge was gathered like threads of a larger web. Safe houses formed the physical backbone of these brotherhoods. They were not grand fortresses, but ordinary dwellings, a baker's loft, a cellar beneath a wine shop, a cottage on the outskirts of a village. Their ordinariness was their strength. Within the assassin might find a change of clothes, food, or a hiding place. Sometimes symbols carved into door frames or marks left in chalk would signal to members that the place was safe. These homes became silent sanctuaries scattered across dangerous lands, invisible to outsiders yet vital to those within the brotherhood. Trust was the glue that held it all together, but it was never given lightly. New members were tested, often harshly. They might be ordered to wait in silence for days to prove patience. They might be commanded to carry messages through hostile towns to test loyalty. They might even be given false secrets to see if they could be trusted not to repeat them. Only after surviving such tests would they be permitted into the true circle where knowledge was shared openly. Communication within the networks was another art. Ordinary letters could not be trusted. Messages were hidden in coded language, in poems, in merchants' ledgers where every third word carried meaning. Sometimes a message was nothing more than the position of a candle in a window or the tilt of a straw figure left in a field. One brotherhood was said to use songs, harmless ballads sung by traveling minstrels whose verses carried hidden instructions understood only by those trained to hear. Such methods turned the entire world into a book of signs legible only to those within the bond. Not all networks were secretive by necessity. Some grew under the protection of rulers who saw usefulness in keeping such brotherhoods close. A duke might employ a circle of shadows, providing them with safety in exchange for their skills. But such arrangements were dangerous. Once bound to a lord, the brotherhood risked becoming pawns in political games, their loyalty tested against their freedom. Many preferred to remain in the twilight, serving no single master, but instead taking contracts where they saw fit. There is also the question of whether these brotherhoods truly felt kinship or whether necessity alone bound them. For survival, yes, they needed one another. But in the silence of candlelit gatherings, bonds often deepened. Shared danger has a way of creating trust more quickly than peace ever can. To wait in the shadows with another, knowing that discovery meant death for both, was to forge a link that could not easily be broken. Songs of soldiers speak of brotherhood in battle, but in truth assassins too knew their own form of comradeship, quieter but no less strong. The presence of these networks made the assassin not merely a figure of fear, but a node in a vast hidden system. One man could be killed, but the brotherhood lived on. One safe house might be discovered, but 5 more remained. Information passed like water through unseen channels, and even kings could not always dam its flow. In this way, the networks gave the assassin resilience that no lone shadow could ever possess. What emerges then is a reminder that the assassin was never simply one person with a dagger. He was part of a living, breathing organism of secrecy, oaths, and whispered trust. He was supported by innkeepers and beggars, merchants and priests, brothers sworn and brothers hidden. Alone he could strike once. Within the brotherhood he could endure, vanish, and rise again elsewhere. And so the image shifts. The solitary shadow is real, but behind it is a web, a brotherhood that stretched unseen across medieval lands, a network that bound lives together in silence, in danger, and in purpose. And it was this hidden fraternity, not the lone blade, that ensured the assassin's survival through centuries of fear and secrecy. Would you like me to move on with part 16? Codes, oaths, and rituals, showing how secrecy and shared symbols gave these brotherhoods their structure and identity. Bạn đã nói right part 16,000 characters. Chat GPT đã nói. Here is part 16. Codes, oaths, and rituals written in the same calm, immersive, sleep-aiding tone, around 6,000 characters. Part 16. Codes, oaths, and rituals. Secrecy alone could not sustain the hidden world of assassins. Secrets slip, words are overheard, promises are forgotten. What bound their craft together more tightly was ritual. Ritual gave form to silence, and oaths gave weight to promises. In the dim corners of medieval life, where candlelight barely reached and the outside world was kept at bay, these men and women created codes that transformed scattered individuals into a community of shadows. The oath was often the first threshold. A newcomer, perhaps nervous, perhaps eager, would be led into a small room lit by a single flame. Before him might rest a simple object, a dagger, a cross, a cup of wine, sometimes even a book. He would be asked to place his hand upon it and repeat words that promised loyalty, silence, and obedience. To break the oath was not merely to abandon comrades, it was to invite punishment both earthly and, as they believed, eternal. In many circles it was said that those who betrayed the bond would wander forever unshriven, their souls restless, their names cursed in whispers. These oaths were not always elaborate, but they were felt deeply. Words spoken in the hush of secrecy lingered in memory, reinforced by fear and by faith. Some swore upon holy relics, hoping to bind themselves before God. Others preferred more worldly symbols, a blade held close to the skin, a cup shared with blood mingled in the wine. Such gestures were stark reminders that this was not a casual alliance. It was a covenant of survival written not on parchment but in lives pledged. Beyond the oath, codes governed behavior. These were seldom written in open script. Instead, they were passed by memory like verses of a song carried from one generation to the next. They taught when to strike and when to wait, how to hide and how to blend, when to speak and when to keep silence. They also taught restraint. An assassin who struck without reason endangered the entire circle. Violence had to be purposeful, contracted, justified within the group's quiet logic. A reckless blade was seen as more dangerous than a watchful enemy. Many of these codes were reinforced by ritual gestures. A bow of the head at a certain angle, a hand clasp that lingered an extra moment, a phrase that on the surface seemed ordinary but carried hidden meaning. The night is calm, one might say, upon entering a tavern, but the dawn may break early, another might reply. To an outsider, meaningless chatter. To insiders, reassurance that both were bound by the same rules. Symbols carried their own power. Some groups carved discreet marks into door frames, visible only to those who knew what to look for. A circle scratched into wood might mean safety. A triangle might warn of danger. Chalk signs drawn on walls could tell whether a safe house was still trustworthy or compromised. These simple shapes turned ordinary streets into maps of hidden meaning, navigable only to the trained eye. At times, the rituals borrowed heavily from religion. The Middle Ages were soaked in faith, and even those who walked in secrecy could not help but mirror its patterns. Ceremonies were held at night, echoing vigils in monasteries. Candles were lit in certain numbers, prayers whispered not to saints but to fate, to shadows, or to nameless guardians of silence. To outsiders, these rituals might appear blasphemous, but for those within they created a rhythm, a solemnity that gave their dangerous lives a sense of order. Ritual also eased fear. To live by the dagger was to dwell constantly in danger. By repeating the same words, the same gestures, the same ceremonies, members reassured themselves that they were part of something enduring. A man might fall, but the oath remained. A safe house might be lost, but the code endured. In this way, ritual became a form of comfort, a constant heartbeat in a world of shifting threats. Initiation ceremonies could vary, but they nearly always tested the resolve of the new recruit. One account tells of novices being blindfolded and led through winding passages, forced to stumble in the dark until they emerged into a circle of silent figures. Another describes the ritual of silence. The initiate must sit without moving or speaking for an entire night, while unseen watchers passed close by, whispering, testing his will. In the morning, if he had not broken, he would be welcomed with a cup of water, symbolizing endurance. Even punishment carried ritual weight. To betray the code, even in small ways, was met with ceremony. Sometimes the offender was shunned in silence, the group turning away as if he no longer existed. In harsher circles, punishment could mean exile or worse. But even this was done with ritual words recited, candles, extinguished, symbols removed. It was a way of saying that the bond was not broken by accident, but cut with deliberate intent. The rituals were not only about secrecy, they were also about identity. In a world where most people belonged to visible orders, guilds of craftsmen, fraternities of students, households of nobles, assassins too needed a sense of belonging, their brotherhoods provided that. A ritual handshake or a whispered phrase reminded them, you are not alone, you are part of something older, larger, hidden but enduring. From a distance of centuries, it is easy to imagine these ceremonies as mere play-acting dramatic flourishes to make the work seem grander. But to those who lived it, they mattered. A ritual transforms fear into courage, chance into certainty, strangers into brothers. And so in the candlelight of hidden rooms, medieval assassins bound themselves together with words, signs, and ceremonies. These codes and rituals were invisible to most of society, yet they pulsed like an unseen current beneath the medieval world. They allowed assassins to trust one another when trust was scarce, to recognize allies in crowded markets, to endure dangers that might otherwise have shattered them. Through them, the shadows gained shape, and the solitary blade became part of a living order, guided by symbols that only a few could ever read. And so, the story of the assassin is not only of silence and daggers, but also of oaths and rituals, the quiet, repetitive acts that made secrecy durable, that turned fear into belonging, that allowed hidden lives to endure for generations in the half-light between truth and myth. To live in secrecy is never only about hiding from others. Secrecy, if it is to last, must also be nurtured from within. For those who made their way in the shadowy profession of the assassin, it was not enough to conceal a dagger or wear a hood pulled low over the brow. Their survival depended on something deeper, on oaths spoken in whispers, on rules remembered more faithfully than scripture, on rituals repeated until they felt as natural as breathing. These quiet structures shaped their hidden lives far more than the blade itself. The first of these was the oath. Imagine a small chamber, stone walls pressing close the air, carrying the faint scent of wax and smoke. A single candle flickers in the center, and beside it rests a dagger, or perhaps a book or a cup filled with wine. A newcomer stands in silence. He may be trembling not from cold but from the weight of what is about to happen. Words are recited by an elder, steady and slow, and then repeated by the novice. He pledges secrecy, loyalty, and obedience. He promises never to reveal what he learns, never to abandon those beside him, and never to act in a way that brings ruin upon the brotherhood. The words themselves might differ across regions or groups, but the meaning was constant. You belong now, and your silence binds you tighter than chains. These oaths were not spoken lightly. In a time when religion saturated daily life, even the smallest promise was considered sacred. To swear upon a relic, a fragment of a saint's bone, a cross carved of ancient wood, a page from scripture, was to risk the fate of one's soul. Some initiations required a drop of blood mixed into wine swallowed as a bond stronger than parchment. Others pressed the novice's hand to a blade, not cutting, only a reminder that betrayal might someday bring the steel closer. Such gestures, small as they seem, gave tangible weight to words that might otherwise vanish in air. Yet the oath was only the beginning. Codes of conduct governed the life that followed. These codes were rarely written down, for written words could betray. Instead, they passed from memory to memory, whispered, like verses taught through example and correction. They told the assassin when to move and when to wait, how to blend into a crowd, how to speak just enough without revealing too much. They warned against reckless killing, for an unnecessary act of violence could draw dangerous eyes upon the group. The assassin was reminded always that his blade was not his alone. It carried the lives of others in its shadow. To strengthen these codes, rituals were woven into daily practice. A phrase seemingly harmless might be exchanged in a crowded inn. "The night is calm," one would say, "but dawn may break early," another might reply. To an outsider, a trivial remark. To those within, a sign of recognition, reassurance that both moved beneath the same hidden order. A handshake with fingers pressed in a particular way, a bow of the head angled just so a chalk mark on a door frame, these tiny signs turned ordinary streets into maps of secret meaning. Religious imagery, too, left its imprint. The Middle Ages were shaped by faith, and the assassins could not help but mirror it. Their ceremonies echoed monastic vigils, candles lit in careful number silence, held in reverence, prayers or chants whispered not to saints but to the unseen guardians of secrecy. Even punishment carried ritual form. A member who betrayed the code might be shunned in silence, treated as though he no longer existed. In harsher cases, exile was marked by extinguishing candles, erasing names from ledgers, or removing symbols once worn with pride. The act of cutting ties was performed with solemn ceremony, a reminder that the bond was not lost by accident but broken deliberately. For initiates, rituals tested both resolve and patience. Some accounts tell of nights spent blindfolded, led through twisting passages until the novice stood before a circle of silent figures. Others speak of the trial of silence, where a man was made to sit alone, motionless, while unseen watchers murmured around him, probing his endurance. At dawn, if he had not faltered, he was offered water or bread, a symbol that he had passed through trial into belonging. These ceremonies were simple, yet they carried immense weight, marking the transition from outsider to brother. Symbols provided further cohesion. A circle carved into wood might mark a safe haven. A triangle scratched into stone might warn of danger. A particular flower laid on a doorstep could mean the same. For those trained to read them, these signs were as clear as letters on a page. For everyone else, they were invisible. In this way, the world became layered, one surface for ordinary life, another hidden layer for those who had sworn the oath. Such rituals did more than preserve secrecy. They gave meaning. In an age where most men found belonging in guilds of craftsmen, households of lords, or parishes of the church, the assassin's life was perilously solitary. The oaths and codes offered a replacement, a community of their own, one that bound together men who otherwise might have been drifters or outcasts. When they exchanged their phrases, shared their gestures, or gathered for their ceremonies, they reminded one another, "You are not alone. You are part of something older, steadier, and hidden." Looking back from centuries later, it is tempting to imagine these acts as elaborate theatre. Yet for those who lived within them, they were not decoration but necessity. Ritual turned fear into courage. Oaths turned strangers into brothers. Codes turned chaos into order. Each repeated gesture, each whispered phrase was a thread in a web that held together lives balanced on the edge of danger. In candlelit rooms and secret corners, the assassin's world was shaped not only by steel but by silence, symbols, and ceremony. These were the invisible walls of their hidden order walls, as firm as stone, built not with mortar but with memory, and strong enough to endure for generations. If the mountains and forests offered concealment, the true stage for the assassin was often the city. Cities of the medieval world were both peril and opportunity. They were dense with people, noisy with carts, and merchants layered with shadows cast by tall walls and crooked streets. In such places, a man could vanish in the press of a crowd more easily than in a wilderness. But they also demanded skill, for a single mistake might be noticed by a dozen watchful eyes. Step into one of these cities in your imagination. Narrow alleys twist behind market squares. Overhead wooden houses lean close enough that their roofs nearly touch, creating tunnels of gloom even in midday. The smells of tanneries, bakers' ovens, and horses mingle in the air. Bells toll from churches calling the hours. Amidst this daily rhythm, there is another rhythm more subtle. The footsteps of men who move with deliberate caution, the glance exchanged across a crowded square, the mark of chalk left near a doorway. The assassin's craft unfolded here, hidden in plain sight. City life provided tools of disguise. A cloak, a hood, or the simple habit of carrying a merchant's sack allowed one to melt into a marketplace. A pilgrim's staff, a craftsman's tools, or the robes of a scholar were costumes ready at hand, borrowed from the everyday landscape. Many assassins learned to mimic voices, to adopt the gait of a weary traveller or the chatter of a foreigner, using performance as much as steel. In crowded inns or bathhouses, information flowed like water, and a sharp ear could gather secrets without ever revealing one's own purpose. The city also demanded networks. Few operated alone. A baker who kept a back door unlatched, a stable boy who signaled with the position of a lantern, a washerwoman who carried messages stitched into hems, these seemingly ordinary figures became quiet accomplices. Each small favor, each gesture unnoticed by the wider world allowed the brotherhood to move safely through watchful streets. Such networks were fragile, bound by loyalty, fear, or payment, yet they transformed the city into a map of hidden passageways. Urban walls also shaped their strategies. Many towns closed their gates at night, locking in those within and barring outsiders. To enter unseen, one might slip in with traders at dusk or bribe a guard to look the other way. Once inside, rooftops offered pathways above the noise bridges between houses spanning narrow lanes. A man who dared to climb could cross half a city without ever touching the ground. From these heights he could study patterns when guards changed, shifts when torches burned low, when crowds thinned. Knowledge of the city's breathing rhythm mattered as much as skill with a blade. Yet danger was ever present. Cities were nests of gossip, and whispers travelled fast. A single rumour of a stranger asking too many questions, a merchant noticing a missing coin, or a guard catching the flash of steel could undo months of careful preparation. The assassins relied not only on silence but on patience. They waited for festivals when masks and noise allowed them to move unseen. They waited for market days when the influx of strangers provided cover. They blended their steps into the city's pulse, moving when others moved, pausing when others paused. To imagine their work is to imagine constant calculation, not the wild chase of a tale told by minstrels, but the steady, patient attention to details. Where does the street turn darkest at twilight? Which tavern is loudest at the 11th hour? Which alley smells strongly enough of tanned leather to cover the trace of another scent? These small observations turn cities into landscapes of opportunity, each corner a tool to be used, each crowd a cloak to wear. And so the cities of the Middle Ages, Paris, Damascus, Venice, Cairo, London, were not only centres of trade and faith, they were also theatres of secrecy where the hidden order moved quietly through streets lined with noise and stone. Their whispers merged with the countless other whispers of urban life, lost to time yet shaping history in ways too subtle to leave easy traces. For most ordinary people of the medieval world, the assassins were not seen with their own eyes. What they knew came through whispers, rumours, or stories told around hearths and marketplaces. Out of these fragments, legends grew half-truths embroidered with imagination, until the boundary between reality and myth blurred into a tapestry of fear. Some tales described assassins as creatures more than men. They were said to appear and vanish like shadows, slipping through locked doors without a sound, able to cross a city wall, as if they were climbing air itself. Mothers warned restless children that if they wandered too far into dark alleys, the men of the mountain might take them away. Merchants crossing dangerous roads swore they had seen silent figures watching from the ridgelines, eyes glowing in the moonlight like those of wolves. These stories exaggerated as they were served a purpose. They gave shape to the unease that lingered in times when trust was fragile and violence was never far away. The myths spread far beyond the mountains where the order was strongest. In European courts, diplomats carried strange reports from the East. They spoke of a secret brotherhood trained from youth, taught to obey their master without hesitation, capable of walking calmly into death, if commanded. Western listeners, already primed by stories of Saracen magic and Eastern mysteries, accepted such tales eagerly. To them, the assassins were almost supernatural, a hidden army bound by fanatic devotion, their blades sharper for the silence that preceded them. Over time, the name itself became a vessel for myth. To call someone an assassin was not merely to describe a killer, it suggested a power beyond ordinary violence. Chroniclers embroidered their accounts, telling of gardens where initiates were intoxicated and shown visions of paradise, convinced they were tasting heaven itself before being sent on their missions. Historians now debate whether these gardens ever existed or whether they were the inventions of enemies who wished to paint the Brotherhood in colours both exotic and terrifying. But in the medieval mind, the image was too vivid to resist. Fear was not confined to far-off rulers or enemy armies. Common villagers, too, passed down their own warnings. In some places, people believed that the assassins could not be bribed or turned, that once a name was spoken in their circle, it was already a death sentence. Others whispered that they used strange poisons, powders that could make a man sleep for days, or substances that caused madness. Even if most never encountered such things, the possibility was enough to sow unease. Rumour has its own gravity, drawing people into belief by the weight of repetition, and so the legend fed itself. Each mysterious death, each sudden disappearance became fuel for the story. If a local lord fell from his horse in suspicious circumstances, some muttered that assassins had arranged it. If a rival merchant died in his sleep after a quarrel, tongues wagged about the Brotherhood's long reach. In truth, many of these events were accidents or the result of more ordinary feuds. Yet attaching the name of the assassins gave them meaning and perhaps a dark glamour. We must remember that fear itself is a kind of weapon. The Brotherhood may not have needed to strike as often as the legends claimed. By letting rumour do its work, they expanded their influence without lifting a blade. A whispered story could guard a mountain pass as effectively as a troop of soldiers, for travellers might think twice before daring to cross. A fearful rival might yield without a fight, surrendering to a reputation carefully cultivated by silence. Thus, the assassins of the Middle Ages were both real and imagined. They were men who walked streets and climbed walls, but they were also myths carried on the wind. The truth of their deeds is tangled with the shadows of story, and it is perhaps in those shadows that their greatest power lay. Would you like me to move on to part 20, The Long Reach of Reputation, where we explore how rulers and empires adapted to the fear of the assassins, sometimes changing their politics entirely? By the late Middle Ages, the assassins had become something larger than their mountain strongholds, larger even than the lives of their leaders and followers. They had become a reputation, a weight carried on the tongues of rulers, merchants, and pilgrims alike. To speak of them was to invoke an invisible pressure, the possibility of a blade drawn in silence, the dread of an unseen hand shaping events from the shadows. For rulers of the Islamic world, this reputation shaped policy. Some negotiated truces, sending gifts or tribute to secure the Brotherhood's neutrality. Others sought alliances, preferring to have the assassins as occasional partners rather than implacable foes. The choice was not always military, it was often psychological. Leaders understood that a whisper of alliance with the assassins could be as useful as an army, while a whisper of their hostility could spread panic faster than cavalry on the march. Even the mighty Crusader states, planted like fragile islands on hostile shores, had to account for this reality. Chroniclers tell us that princes and kings hesitated before offending the Brotherhood, remembering the fates of those who had ignored the warning signs. Diplomacy took on an edge sharpened not only by armies but by the knowledge that a single night's intrusion could undo years of rule. Thus, strategy in the region was not drawn only on parchment maps, it was drawn also in the imagination, where the threat of a hidden blade carried as much weight as battalions of soldiers. In Europe, far from the mountains of Persia and Syria, the legend grew into something stranger still. The word assassin entered new languages, stripped of its original meaning but rich with dread. It came to mean any secret murderer, any killer whose motives seemed larger than personal gain. Poets, monks, and merchants repeated the stories until the Brotherhood became less a political reality and more a symbol of the mysterious East, dangerous, exotic, and unsettlingly efficient. By the 13th century, the Mongols swept across Asia, tearing through fortresses and cities alike. Even the assassins could not withstand that storm forever. Their strongholds fell one by one, and the careful order that had endured for generations was broken. Yet even as their physical presence waned, their reputation lingered. To this day, the echo of their name can still conjure images of silent knives and secret loyalties. The lesson of their story is not simply about violence, nor about the intricate politics of medieval Persia and Syria. It is about the strange durability of reputation. A small order, never numbering more than a fraction of the armies around them, managed to shape the fears of kings and the imagination of continents. They understood that belief itself could be a weapon, and they wielded it with precision. As we draw this long exploration to a close, imagine once more the mountains where the Brotherhood lived. The stone fortresses rise against the sky, now crumbling with centuries, their walls open to wind and silence. The gardens, real or imagined, are gone. The voices that once echoed in the halls are stilled, and yet the name remains spoken in many tongues, carrying shadows across history. It is fitting, perhaps, that the assassins endure not through armies or monuments, but through the quiet persistence of story. They remind us that the line between history and legend is thin, that fear can last longer than walls, and that even the most secretive of brotherhoods can leave a mark on the memory of the world. So as night deepens and the pace of this telling slows, let us leave them where they belong, part fact, part fable, always in shadow. Close your eyes and picture the mountains fading into mist, the fortresses sinking back into the stone. The assassins are gone, but their reputation drifts on the wind, carrying us gently into silence and into sleep.